This is an Irreverent podcast. Check out irreverent.fm for shows from all our friends. Hello and welcome to Evangelical. I'm your host, Blake Chastain. My guest this week is the musician, author, and activist Jennifer Knapp. She and I spoke earlier this summer about her musical career both inside and outside the CCM industry, the pressure put on her and others to exhibit a performative faith within those constraints, how she returned to music on her own terms after a midlife retirement, and her work with Inside Out Faith, an organization she helped found to support LGBTQ people of faith like herself. Jennifer is on tour right now and has a few dates coming up in the Midwest this December. Check out jenniferknapp.com/shows for more details. I'd also like to mention up here at the top again that Evangelical will be featured in a upcoming CBS documentary that will be airing on December 2nd. So check your local listings for details about that. As always, you can find me on Twitter at brchastain and the show on Twitter at XEvangelicalPod. You can also search for the Evangelical Facebook group on Facebook and support the show via Patreon at patreon.com/XEvangelicalPod or by buying merch at XEvangelicalPodcast.com/shop or just by leaving a rating on Apple Podcasts. All right, everyone, let's get into it. Hi everyone, and welcome back to Evangelical. My guest this week is Jennifer Knapp. Jennifer is best known for her musical career, and many of my listeners will know her from her time in the CCM scene, as well as her time in most recent years since 2010 when she returned to the music scene. We're going to be talking a lot about her experience. Welcome to the show, Jennifer.
Hey, good to be here.
Let's just start where we usually do on the show and just get a good sense of where you're from and everything. I this past couple weeks I've been listening to your memoir, which was really fascinating. But I'd love to sort of hear you talk a little bit about where you're from and what your initial background was.
Yeah. Well, I'm very aware of the fact that I grew up in Kansas. I don't. It's just it's from growing up in one of those places, and I don't know. It's so strange that I talk about where I'm from, even though I haven't lived in Kansas for well over 20 years now.
Yeah.
But I grew up in a relatively small community of about like somewhere between 10 and 15,000 people. It's pretty small, small town Chanute, and yeah, just kind of a blue collar family growing up in the heartland of America. It's kind of it seems so ordinary and so typical America to me that it seems it's always really weird when I try and talk about it because I'm like, oh, that's so boring. It's just like I'm just like everybody else. And in terms of like the religious experience, I was just talking about this the other day. I mean, I think the assumption is that everybody believed in God, so like my family didn't necessarily go to church on every Sunday, although my grandmother was very religious about it. And when I would go spend the weekends with her, she'd make me put on, pantyhose and like painful shoes and dresses. I thought Jesus was a crock of something. It's just so painful to like kind of have to like. It was like Scout that's why I related to Scout and To Kill a Mockingbird. I just felt like, people were spitting in my hair in order to kind of dress me up and get me wild thing ready for church. It was just kind of a foreign experience. But at the same time, those were really meaningful experiences to me as I grew up, even kind of making fun of I don't know. I just remember being aware that like there were people that went to church all the time. And occasionally, I'd be offloaded to a Sunday school with all these kids, and they'd be talking about these Bible stories and flannel graph Jesuses and stuff like that. And it was something that I appreciated at the same time. I just wasn't in it on a regular basis to kind of really identify. So, by the time that I got to college and I got in involved with some friends of mine who were evangelical Christians, I just, it was a strange thing. I just always assumed that everybody was a Christian. I kind of took it for granted, and everybody around me believed in God. And then, like I said, when I met evangelical Christians, this was like a whole other kettle of fish. But until then, for the most part, I just grew up as a normal Midwestern kid, and generally speaking, pretty good. Do unto others as they do unto you, and God is a real thing, and just kind of went from there. And things would radically change after I got involved with evangelicalism. That was
Yeah. Yeah. I definitely I grew up in small town, Indiana. So like there is that, it is sort of like in the air sort of things, as far as what you're talking about with people just sort of are default Christian, that sort of thing. And
right. And well, and I think it's, but generally speaking, assumed. I mean, like occasionally you run into somebody who would go, God is dead, and they're an atheist, and they were kind of weird, kind of fussy people. And then there were like the other people, and there were people in my community that were on the extremes. They, did talk about Jesus. I had exposure to people who did talk about kind of in an interesting way, like, oh, I'm a Christian, and they would say it. And this was back, like mid to late 80s. During my youth, I'd meet some of those people who went to church every Sunday and prayed at every, babysitters who made me pray over my snacks and had experiences like that. But they were just kind of like this extra gear or something of, kind of Christians that, certainly my family didn't relate to. So, I never really, growing up, I never really made the distinction between people who were or weren't Christian, but I also realized that there were people out there who were, to me at the time, I would have said they were a little bit weird or a little bit strange. And then, I don't know, I didn't really know how to quantify it. They were just more serious, but I never was exposed to people who downgraded the religious experience or the marginal religious experience, of my family growing up. I never was, I wasn't around people. I wasn't around enough people who were, getting into conversations like, oh, your family aren't Christians because they don't go to church every Sunday, or, there's something wrong with you because you don't pray over your meal. There wasn't really that sense of competition for me growing up. So it didn't really, that wasn't something I experienced until, into the heart of the 90s and evangelicalism. And when I got, into that as a profession.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That whole sense of lukewarm Christians and all that sort of lovely jargon that people are.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and in some really good, I think even in some really good ways. I mean, I remember as a little girl, occasionally my mom would take me to this beautiful little country church. It's still there. It's exactly like a Norman Rockwell postcard, this little white painted Methodist church out in the middle of the country. And Lord knows how as a pastor you get stationed to one of these churches, but we would go occasionally, and and as little girls, because they didn't have like a big Sunday school, we would sit and listen to the pastor. And I remember finding the experience engaging. And I don't know that, at the time that made me, think anything other than, that, I don't know. It didn't make me think anything extraordinary. At the same time, like it was just, the religious experience had a meaning to me at that time, even at a young age, without necessarily feeling like it was something that I had to be convinced of. It a shared experience. And I find looking back on that was really touching. And I'd like to think that maybe those put a sense of normalcy to a spiritual journey, and, the kind of crafting of a human being in goodness and grace that made sense to Christianity in a way that I didn't necessarily, I think that would come back to kind of be helpful to me later on in life when, ticking off the boxes, when you weren't able to tick off the expected boxes, that was an offense. I didn't grow up in an environment where, there was a failure related to Christianity, but more of an experience and a journey. So I'm really grateful, strangely enough, to have had, a kind of a calm upbringing, even though I think, sometimes like on my, somebody wrote on my Wikipedia page, and I don't know how this got into print, but it lives out that I grew up in, the quote is that I was raised in an irreligious family. And I see that as a code for I wasn't raised evangelical,
Yeah. Yeah, that does seem pretty coded. Yeah. And in light of everything you've just said in all that context, I mean, absolutely. Because that just doesn't reflect your actual experience.
Yeah, I think that was kind of the strange thing when I started, as I got, as into my mid 20s, and I, had a career where I'm working in and around, like as a Christian music performer, I'm talking about my faith and I'm talking about this experience.
Hmm.
Um, it was strange how I started to have, you know, the experience that I'd had that had led me to want to be able to talk about this in my art was also being met with qualifiers that were essentially kind of downgrading the previous experience that I'd had to lead me there, which I found really strange, um,
Yeah.
really difficult to kind of deal with early on when I was really genuinely having an experience that was radically affecting and changing my life for the better, but also getting some really confusing messages as if, everything that I had experienced up to that point was somehow invalid. It was a really strange thing to have to kind of go through and navigate.
Yeah. Yeah. And you capture that a little bit, just in remembering back to your memoir and what you mentioned actually just now. You did have you got involved in more evangelical style things or evangelical things as far like in college. So what led you to that where that was your entry into that style of Christianity?
Yeah, first was I think a bit of naivete in terms of like I didn't really know. I like your term there, the style of Christianity. I really had no idea that there were styles of Christianity at all.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
that's just kind of how the way that I grew up. I just didn't have that kind of exposure to a diverse treatment of religious experience at all. And then, I got to college and quite a few of my friends were evangelical friends. I was going through an extremely rough patch of just trying to figure out how to valuing myself. I was, pretty much drunk for a couple of years, and just, really self-destructive and trying at the same time. I think just really the only way I know how to explain it is just really spiritually grappling. And I don't mean necessarily in a religious way, but in terms of a fundamental, deep spiritual appreciation of myself. I'd gone
Mm.
through enough experiences there. And I think that's where I kind of try and talk about in the book is that, trying to find a sense of my own dignity inside of that. When I met up with my evangelical friends, they were introducing me to scripture in a way that, as a writer, I think, and as an artist, when I read some of the scripture and some of the Bible, these were stories that were really meaningful to me.
Hmm.
And that like any good piece of deeply meaningful sharing that we do in our storytelling really made me understand the gospel in a new way, that there was at the very least, even though I didn't really get into, believing in, I don't know, I couldn't, like, from a scientific point of view, for an example, I couldn't really get into like believing, say a choice of evolution over, the Noah and the flood or something like that.
Right.
Like
Yeah.
it's beyond my comprehension, but the poetry of that and the deep spiritual sense and the meaningness of myself really resonated in the scripture that my evangelical friends were sharing with me.
Hmm.
And then the second part of that was, they were a group of students there that were sincerely worried about my well-being. I was on a very self-destructive path, and it's not a light thing when I say that I'm actually really fortunate that I survived that. I was making choices that were really dangerous and potentially physically harming to me. And here were some well-minded friends who thought, if only I found Jesus, the miracle of that would save my life. And those two things kind of connected, and truly in the evangelical sense, which was an entirely new thing that I'd ever heard of. I needed to accept Jesus Christ as my personal Lord and Savior. So not really kind of understanding what that meant at all. There was, for me, a moment of surrender to that story, and that idea that God cared about me enough that I was willing to kind of, I'd surrendered to everything else. I was like, what difference does it make? I'll surrender to this too. But that surrender, like, I don't mean to make tongue in cheek of it. It was a kind of surrender that was like a last ditch effort. It's like, I don't believe in me. I don't believe that it's possible for me to be loved. And here is this conversation with the divine that says that I'm worth that time and that energy. And so that was kind of like the gateway into that. In a grocery store parking lot about 3:00 in the morning, I said my little prayer, and things didn't miraculously change after that point, but the huge paradigm shift at that point for me was one that radically did change my life. At that moment, I thought, there's something special about being human and being alive, and something, connected to the divine in that I really wanted to explore. But I didn't really, then, the next step was in, going to church and going to these fellowship meetings with other students and prayer meetings and Bible studies. And that, that's a whole kind of shift into another culture shock. I just had no idea that this thing existed. And trying to balance it out with a legitimately earnest decision that I'd made to kind of follow in this path, and then walking into a world that I wanted to be in, and at the same time was just an utterly strange experience for me that I was, both having to learn how to navigate and was being drawn into all at the same time, like just legitimately just wanted to be there. So
yeah. Yeah, so you had this really meaningful conversion experience. I think that is probably an appropriate term in that situation, right? Like you have this sort of turning point moment, and then you get immediately plugged into this entire support network of sorts. And
I deeply appreciate, like, in this vein, I still struggle today with saying that I wonder, I do wonder to this point today, how do I explain a massive paradigm shift that I experienced in that moment, and resistance to this idea that there was something like overwhelmingly miraculous that happened on that day and in that moment when, I'm really uncomfortable saying I gave my life to Christ. There's something strangely, there's something strange to me about that statement. At the same time, I have to, I've really wrestled with this in the last 15 years. Like, how do I explain the dramatic paradigm shift that really was, and a life-saving paradigm shift that is, and yet at the same time trying to extricate it from this fanatical religious experience into something that was, while still trying to preserve its meaning. And that's taken, a long time and several years to kind of be able to kind of navigate through to where not trying to rob the meaning of that occasion. And so I guess what I'm saying is, like, the thing that I use the term conversion way less, but I definitely love the concept of turning toward. There was a decision to be able to turn toward and in a direction that's meaningful. And I think it was a religious experience in part, but it doesn't necessarily always translate out sometimes in the way that we talk about it, and the way that the evangelical tradition is sometimes easy to believe.
Sure. Yeah. And all those sorts of phrases, like giving your life to Christ and all those things, to your point, they are very loaded sort of, and they carry a lot of meaning that can be hard to accept in retrospect, or like if we sort of have changed our position since then.
Yeah, but at the same time, I think there's a concept of surrender that deeply resonates with me, and at that time. And, for somebody like, I guess I'm conscientious of that. Like, I
Hmm.
don't want to strip away from anyone's experience who would use that language. I
Yeah.
mean, we're all kind of crippled by the way that we articulate to another human being the sincerity of the experience that we're having.
Hmm.
Uh, and I think that's been a bit of the challenge that I've experienced culturally over, the last decade or so, of just trying to say, listen, I wouldn't necessarily use that language, but I do relate to that. And I'm trying to find, and particularly I think as a songwriter, I'm trying to always find new ways of relating an experience that, even though this is a language that I might use, I want to use the language in my art or in my creativity in a way that allows as many people as possible to step into it.
Yeah.
Obviously the challenges of that, inside of that community, is if I didn't speak with the language and if I didn't speak with that code, then I didn't get to speak at all. And
Right.
that was a little bit of the challenge of that. But also, I think it was a good one. I think it, ended up bearing some good fruit in some of the ways that I was writing and creating music.
Mm. And that's actually a good segue. Let's talk a little bit about sort of what the role of music played in your life up until that point in college, and when did you start to like begin to make the turn towards the CCM industry, or just even playing music with other evangelicals and things like that?
Well, I started music. I was probably about fourth grade or so, and I was going into college. I was actually a trumpet player,
Hmm.
and it wasn't until I was maybe like 18 or so, getting ready to go to college. I'm like, oh, I don't. I was playing as many instruments as I could because I'd planned on being a band teacher, and I had anticipated in college that I'd need to learn kind of how to basically play as many things as I could. And so I picked up a guitar and started to kind of learn that among the many instruments that I was playing. So when I was sorry,
You're fine.
sorry, my partner just came home.
That's okay.
You can edit that part out.
It's okay. Yeah.
I was I was playing music, before I got to college. And when I started, when I became a Christian, one of my friends was saying, why don't you write? Like, I would play cover songs on guitar. I was, learning songs like by Tracy Chapman and the Cowboy Junkies and the Indigo Girls and stuff like that. And one of my friends was kind of, generally speaking in my environment, it was just like, oh, you need to write songs about your faith now. You don't need to necessarily play songs from the world. And I thought that was kind of a weird thing. But at the same time, like, it never occurred to me to write my own music. And so I kind of, as I was having this experience and this journey, I started to write about that. And it showed up in my music, and it was pretty cool. And, then I started playing, my friends would really like it in college, and they'd ask me to play it. And I'd play at my Fellowship of Christian Athletes meeting, or when I started to go to church, that my church would ask me to play special songs. I ended up in a band. I had no idea, like, I had no concept of what Christian music was. So I didn't know how to write it necessarily. I was just kind of writing about my own experience. And it wasn't until I'd met a few people that started exposing me to other Christian music, but I was well into it. Like, I didn't really aspire to get into what I was doing, but a couple years of doing that, a pretty fast track, actually, I ended up signing a record deal, and I thought, wow, that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
But I kind of like in that sense, like, I was kind of really, as I was struggling culturally, I put that into my music, and I struggled with my own doubt. I would put that up front in my music, and I think a lot of people really related to that. And I didn't really know how to be what everybody wanted me to be, and I think I channeled that frustration into the way that I talked about God. And there was a lot of, I think particularly with my first record, there was a lot of contemplation on that record about whether or not the divine, that God could see me in a way that was respectable, even if I didn't measure up to the expectations. And I think a lot of people really related and resonated with that. And, that took off. I mean, I ended up doing like 3 records and having a nice long career because of it.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I was actually a big. So I went to high school in like the mid '90s, late '90s, early 2000s, and I was.
Oh, you were my target audience.
I absolutely was. I worked in a Christian bookstore. So I recommended your CDs. I sold your CDs. I listened to your CDs. I was even just messaging with a friend from my youth group that I'm still in touch with from way back. And she talked about she still plays your songs on her guitar and everything. So yeah, like I remember that moment sort of late '90s, early 2000s. Like CCM had, and I know it was because I was in high school and like everybody glamorizes whatever music was playing when they were in high school, but like there was there was Cadman's, there was some of the early Third Day stuff. It felt like a really good, like genuine time for the scene.
Yeah, and as an artist, artistically, it was really beautiful to be a part of that. I mean, I really felt like I had genuinely found a community there. There were artists that I deeply respect that were in that same vein. Like for a few years there was a
Yeah.
lot of real life experience. And I think Sixpence None the Richer were doing.
Mm-hmm.
There were groups to kind of add to that, groups like the 77s, Dakota Motor Company, Michael Knott. Those were like a lot of West Coast artists that were outside of Nashville that weren't necessarily evangelical, but were talking about this in their music and in their art, doing, taking
Yeah.
a spiritual approach to that under the umbrella of Christianity, but not necessarily trying to advertise it or be something, but to have that experience. And I think as a young person, that was really inspiring to me, to be in and around those artists. And yet, strangely enough, I think as artists like Sarah Mason,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I mean, you can name, a ton of Out of the Gray was a more adult contemporary group that I really liked at the time. There were a lot of artists that were really exploring, how far and how they could write about their spiritual experience without necessarily having to be a worship experience or necessarily trying to sell Christianity, but just be a community of people who understood what this experience was like.
Yeah.
And it's obviously that's shifted from that time. I think now pretty much if you want to be a Christian artist, you've got to have it seems to me like when I turn on the radio station now, you have to have a pretty good, I don't know. I feel like our experiences have been edited out of that, and it was really confrontational. I think that did create problems inside of the evangelical narrative for artists like me who were like, writing just songs about our experience. Yeah.
From on this way. I have proved to live a dastardly day. I hid my face from the saints and the angels who sing of your glory. But you had in mind that through my weakness shine, show me grace. A little more than I can give, little more than I deserve.
Yeah, but I mean, like you said, like you did bring an honesty that I think was evident in your work at that time, and that was not lost on people. It wasn't lost on me and the people in my youth group that listened to your music, that sort of thing. I mean, damn, like we put a lot of pressure on ourselves, like in those youth groups and things like that, to be a very good person, or like to try to measure up, and to have someone express that sort of uncertainty the way you did on your albums and everything was, cathartic.
I don't think that ended there,
Right. Oh yeah.
The thing to me about that is that, like I'm honestly shocked and surprised that, some close to 20 years later, the same, I still talk to the same people,
Right.
those of us who had gone through that experience and then are full grown adults and, responsible, not, the pressure to kind of conform to what, maybe our family or religious communities want. I think there is still a large portion that are, still involved in their Christian communities, or I think they're even more kind of still on the fringes. Like, how do we make sense of that sincere experience? And yet at the same time, feeling, I don't know. I just think culturally, a lot of us grew up with this invitation to, you can be who you are, that there's a valuable experience here. There's a spiritual experience to be had here. And, that sense of, yeah, come as you are. I mean, I don't know any other way to say it. Like, we are who we are, and we're still looking for something redeeming out of that in relationship to our religious experience as well. And I just think 20 years down the line, we haven't given up on that. I think a lot of people that I talk to still really resonate with the original decision. Like I'm talking about, what about this sincere experience about entering into and aware, with a great deal of awareness and deliberateness of stepping into this experience that I call Christianity. And yet I still feel like 20 years later, I'm somewhat on the margins of my church. What does that mean? And what is that? And now that we're having families and we're getting married and we have responsibilities, that we want to, that we've been impacted by our faith in a particular way to want to be people with dignity and caring and equality and social justice and all of those kinds of things, to be Christ-like. What does that mean when we've also had the backside of that going, man, I don't want you to think I'm a nut job here. I don't want to be, what is it? What is that thing we're trying to communicate when we don't want to be wrapped into the Liberty University, Jerry Falwell kind of motif? Right. How do you do that? How do you hold on to something that has both offended you and inspired you at the same time? And as again, I kind of go back to music. Like, I don't know how to process that without trying to enter into that and create music about it, bring that out and kind of talk about that at shows. And so, yeah. I don't know. It's just been really fascinating to me how many people that are in the same boat kind of that we're talking about. It's just like, man, I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but some of that water is pretty nasty. And What do I do with that?
That's definitely the predicament that a lot of people that listen to the show that have been through the things that we sort of generationally have been through. Like, it's hard, and it's there's no easy answer. it's definitely sort of like a lot of times it boils down to individual choice. What you can stomach in some ways. So with your career, like you mentioned, you had these albums that came out quickly, and I didn't even really realize, until I was listening to your memoir. I listened to it as an audiobook, and I didn't realize that it all sort of happened within the space of a few years. It definitely sounds like it was this really intense experience, and then through a series of circumstances, like you had to step away. So what led to that, and how did that stepping away from CCM for a period and from music in general, how did that sort of inform your life?
Yeah, it was a pretty quick turnaround. I think my Kansas, my first record came out I think officially in 1998. My last record that I did with Goatee Records was released in 2001, and then I did my last gig in 2002. And so, I look back at that, I'm like, holy crap, that really wasn't that long. It felt like an eternally long time, actually. At the same time, I did, so it's no wonder to me, like, my first answer was like, why I walked away was principally just exhaustion. I just couldn't take it anymore. And every time I kind of tried to step away and take a little bit of time off, there were, kind of these these conversations centering around my failure as a Christian to kind of not participate. You know, it was like a sacrifice that I was supposed to make in terms of, you know, if I wasn't able to continue on that journey, then something was probably wrong with me spiritually. That was some of the conversations that I was having behind the scenes, and
Gross.
that was it was devastating to me.
Yeah,
Because,
that's awful.
you know, I think, you know, I was genuinely needing some time, and by that time I was probably like 20. What would I have been in 2002? 25 or 26 or 27, I think. And just utterly exhausted. And at the same time, I think the other thing that I tend to see is that by that age, I'd been a Christian for a while, maybe 8 years or so. And I was starting to come into my own, I think, as an adult, as somebody who was starting to have my own theological thoughts and a little bit of courage to say some of this stuff was bullshit. And realizing that I was also in a marketplace where I was expected to kind of spruik this stuff that I didn't believe in. And at this, you know, I didn't really know how to manage that at all. I think there was still a great deal of immaturity and just going, man, something's going on here. And I'm not sure. I just really didn't know how to stomach being responsible for pushing a kind of perfectionist Christianity that I was felt like as an artist, I'd always kind of been laboring against. And I didn't really know how to manage that very well. And to the point where in not pushing that agenda through, and I think there were some legitimate things where I was definitely being asked to push an evangelical agenda through, particularly as a woman, some ideals of what women were supposed to look like. About that time, you know, the sexual purity movement was moving through, and it was like true love waits and that kind of thing. And I was being asked quite a bit or admonished quite a bit when I didn't live up to the ideal of what a Christian woman looked like. And I just found that really frustrating.
Yeah.
And so I don't know. And it's just personally, I just kind of collapsed underneath of that. So I just said, I really honestly can't do this. I was pretty suicidal at the end of it, going, just feeling like such a failure that, you know, it was like one choice or the other. Either I had to continue doing something I didn't have the strength, energy, or courage to do anymore. And on the other side of it, death, just feeling like a failure because I was supposed to do something that I couldn't. And so I was like, this is unhealthy. I got to get out of here. And it doesn't really matter what comes next. It was truly an act of self-care. And it was devastating to me because I loved what I did. I loved being a musician, and music had been a part of my life for, you know, like I said, since I was 14. It'd been like 15 years, like my entire life, basically growing up as a kind of autonomous human being. It involved music and participating with community that way. And I just had to go away. It just felt like such a loss. And frankly, I felt like a failure in Christianity too. I feel like, you know, these years later, there's a bit of a story of an acceptance to the art that I was doing as a musician. I did not feel like people, I think it's funny that people missed me when I was gone. I just found, like, all these years later, I found it shocking because as an artist at the time, I thought I was insignificant, that it didn't matter, that people didn't like what I was doing. And not that I think that's a qualifier in any way, but I didn't see it. Like, it just felt like I was just, you know, pushing a rock uphill, and it just seemed stupid to kill myself over something that just didn't really matter. So I walked away. It was a self-preservation act. And, you know, I hadn't dated in 10 years. I'd been celibate for 10 years because I was freaking terrified. And turns out that was, you know, at that time, you know, that decision was one that helped me realize that, you know, my own sexual orientation as a gay woman, you know, which I know a lot of people like to look back and narrate that as like, oh, I quit Christian music because I was gay. But like, I didn't even have the ability at that time to even comprehend sexual orientation because I was just so wasted in terms of what I could handle. I just needed to move off and find my own voice again. And frankly, I thought I was walking away from Christianity. I thought I was walking away from music. I thought I was walking away and going to hell. So literally, like, it was such an utterly devastating experience for me to have to make that move. But it turned out to be a really good one. You know, it took me 7 years to recover from that before I would kind of get back and pick up my guitars again.
Yeah. I'm sorry that, to hear that, that much sort of pressure had been internalized and put upon you by all these different people and expectations. And I mean, yeah, the sort of totalizing of all of that you just mentioned, as far as, yeah.
Well, I mean, I think that in retrospect, I think it's the danger of the if-then statements in the spirit. Like, what I would say is, we're all on a spiritual journey to a certain point. The if-then statements are a real test and potentially damaging, I think, particularly because, like I said, this is, 20 years in the making of being able to say, it took me a lot of courage, actually, strangely enough, to say that my initial entrance into Christianity as a choice, and as a concerted effort and a deeply meaningful choice on top of that, was leveraged in an if-then statement. If you are sincere, if this deeply meaningful experience that you had is true, then you will do this, or you will look like this, was always challenged. And there was only so many years that I could maintain that. Some people never feel that pressure or that burden. Some people go a lot longer. Some people don't last. I didn't know how to manage that, and it took a long time of having my own space. I don't know. I just, all I remember is just grieving and mourning after I left after I left CCM, because I not only felt like I'd lost music, but I also felt like I'd lost something. I'd lost face, and I'd lost, I'd wondered, basically everyone not everyone, but there were some key people around me at that time that said, yeah, if you walk away from this, then you are denying your faith. And I'd be like, man, how do I tell you the truth that I can't take one more step? That, now is a time of rest. And why is that being leveraged against the sincerity of what my spiritual experience means to me? And, and I think that, I don't know, in the long run, I am as shocked as anybody that I still claim and participate in the faith experience, in the way. But, these years on, like, now I understand that in a different way, where, somebody being critical and making those kinds of if-then statements, if you don't believe this, then you're not a Christian, or, this, you didn't have a meaningful experience. And I'm kind of like, that's bullshit, like, yeah. I am who I am, and this is the reality of where I'm at. And if that's what you believe, that's okay. But I need reliable people who are willing to travel with me on this journey, and that are willing to kind of have that. And I think that's the challenge that we have inside of our faith communities on a variety of different levels now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Sorry, I had one thought in mind and then it totally spaced out. I'm going to edit
you can
that.
Edit yourself. It's all good.
Yeah, I can edit myself. I apologize for that. So you have this time off, and you just give yourself this, you give yourself this time to really heal from all of this intensity. What sort of prepared you to return to music and to return to that sort of part of your expression? Because actually, again, in your book, you do talk about how, like, during that period you also stopped playing music. Like, you stopped. I mean, it's sort of this holistic thing. What brought you back, and what made you return to music and return to engaging in these sorts of conversations again?
Yeah, I mean, it's been fairly incremental. I don't want to kind of, there's no like one magic pill or one magic day. It's truly been kind of like a step-by-step process. Mostly, like, I was bored. I spent I got, after 7 years of retirement, I'd literally had a midlife retirement. I'd been working at an antique shop for about a year, and it wasn't, I don't know, I had a sense inside of myself that it was kind of felt like in that time I started to wake up and realize I was like, oh, was I just in some dream? I just didn't feel useful. And I missed my guitars. And so as I picked them up, I just like, I'm not going to let the anger, the frustration, the hurt, separate me from something that used to be like a cool thing. And I wonder if I still like music, that was kind of like the first question. And I picked up my guitars and I started to play. And at first it was extremely painful because kind of all that I knew how to play were all these faith-based music, and I just couldn't even stomach it. I was just angry and mad, and I'd realized that, I didn't have anything else to play. So I tried writing some new music, and yet the language that I had used was still deeply spiritual that I wanted to talk about. And so I just kind of wrestled with the demons for a little bit, but that was kind of like all in private. And one of the steps that I made was just taking off the expectations of that. Like,
Yeah.
I want to play again. And I said, you don't have to write a record, and you don't have to go back and play for anybody. It's okay for you to pick up this guitar and just play it for the sake of the gift and for the sake of enjoyment of that. Yeah. And then I thought, man, I really want, I'd been doing that for a while, and I'm like, man, I kind of really want to write a record. Like, I remember my grandfather for many years had said, I just want you to record. I want you to just record you and your acoustic and send me something someday. So I thought, oh man, I'll do that for him. I had the time to do it. And so I did a little project that was just me and my guitar and for him. And then I got that put together, and then I was like, oh man, these are really good. Like, I kind of want to play these in concerts and stuff. So I sent them back to some friends of mine in Nashville, and they're like, yeah, this is really good. You should come and make a record. And it just was like step by step. And I was like, oh crap, if I go back to Nashville, like everybody's going to know I'm gay. like all of these kinds of things just kind of kept step by step. And, and I thought, all right, well, I'll play, but I won't. Thank God now that I kind of was like really grateful for my sexual orientation, because I thought, oh, that will make the Christians not want to talk to me anymore. And I don't have to worry about that. Yeah. I don't have to worry about engaging faith community and I was actually super excited that I could have that to myself again. So I don't know. It was just this weird mix of just taking off the expectations and taking off the things from my plate and just focusing in the moment of the one thing that you could do. And, you can write a song and you can sing it, and then what comes next? Not thinking about all the possible consequences that go after, but just trying to do that thing one at a time. And, and I think that was actually strangely a redemptive process for me getting back into this spiritual conversation. Like, I realized that I hadn't lost my faith. I had just run into a big difficulty with how I talked about my faith. And at that point, I'm now in my 30s and I have a little bit more of my own voice. And I think even with the excuse of my sexual orientation, knowing that I was already just fundamentally going to be pissing people off because of something about myself that I couldn't, deny or necessarily hide, I'm like, all right, well, let's just do this, let's start from square one and just being ourselves. And like, that's kind of the deal I made. Like, I wasn't going to go back and play music and be in front of people anymore if I couldn't be myself. Yeah. Because it was too destructive in the first time. I didn't want to be a frog in the water and have that slowly creep up on me. And I think that's kind of the advantage of age and experience. And I didn't really have anything to lose. I didn't really anticipate that when I came back that people would actually buy records or, that I'd be 3 records into it now. But I'm really grateful. But I think part of that honesty that I was, I feel like has guided me. There's been, I don't know. I feel like somewhere in there that as an artist, I've been really fortunate because I've always just kind of had my heart on my sleeve, and I've always just said, hey man, this is what I'm going through. And it shows up in my music, and I've shared it. And I've not necessarily wanted to be a rock star or necessarily said, hey, I know for a fact that people are going to like what I play. I just kind of humbly kind of presented it and said, yeah, if people like it, then I'll get to play. Mm-hmm. And if it's resonating and if it's conversational, it's worth us all getting together, then I'm willing to share it. And I think that's just kind of how it's come out. And I think it's in that process has been redemptive to me of my religious experience as well. I mean, I think in coming back and playing, I didn't want to be associated with Christianity at all. At the same time, I've realized that's part of my language, and it shows up in what I'm doing. It's really hard to keep it private. But I think there is a distinction. I think now that, it's an active choice that I've made, particularly being on the secular side of things, to say, yes, I am a person of faith. Christianity is a tradition that I have, but I'm not necessarily eager to use music as a tool to try and convince people to be that. I don't resist it if it shows up in my music, but I don't necessarily try and use my music as the propaganda for that. So
yeah.
It's a little bit different the way that I approach it now.
Yeah, definitely. I am curious, I guess, as being someone that was this sort of like, this was, I was sort of, like I mentioned, a youth group kid in the early 90s or late 90s, early 2000s. And like seeing people like you and like, sort of, and other musicians, from your group that all sort of came up together, like Derek Webb from Cademans and others that like continue to engage with spirituality but in like a new setting, like sort of outside of the CCM sort of direct CCM markets and everything. What are your sort of are there any thoughts, or is there anything that sort of connects all of your experiences, or do you think it is just part of, like you've mentioned, just growing up and exploring something differently through your music and through your careers?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's interesting you mentioned Derek Webb. He and I did a tour together, like one of my first tours back actually as a musician. So he and I have spent a lot of time together. We drank a few beers and waxed on poetically about our experiences.
Yeah.
There's something about, I don't know. I think there's something about that experience, and that's been, even with my time with Derek, something redemptive about the artistic process that I really appreciated from hanging out with him, is this idea that, because I didn't grow up around with artists. Like in the CCM experience, like most of what I had experienced and the people that I was around, there was a lot resting on, your person and your spirituality and kind of conforming to what Christianity was marketable, and what it could look like. And I don't necessarily mean that in a bad way. I mean, it's kind of the nature of the beast. I mean, once you start to market something, even no matter how genuine you start, there's a branding issue, right? And then even if it starts as something genuine, there's still eventually what you create is kind of an avatar,
Yeah.
a script or kind of a shell. And even, and I would say that to a certain extent, like I think that partly, backwards looking as a CCM artist, I felt like an avatar for Christianity and not necessarily like a person who was having that experience. And so when I talk to guys like Derek, I think one of the things that the artists that I deeply respect, and why I call them artists, is because they've had their life experiences and they're trying to create music in and around that. So rather than writing for a marketplace, they're writing genuinely about their experiences. And so, I would be as shocked as anybody if one day Derek decided to write a praise and worship record, as much as I'd probably be shocked if I did. But at the same time, I think if that were to ever occur, I think I'd probably genuinely believe that was something that was occurring for them and they wanted to explore as an artist. And I don't mean to make that sound critical of CCM marketplace. It's just an interesting thing because it's the only genre of music that depends on the lyrical content. You have to specifically talk about Christianity. The way that CCM, particularly that kind of coming out of Nashville, the way that that's evolved is you have to specifically be evangelical and tied into a Christ narrative or a Jesus narrative. And I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing, but it's you have to be. I think as an artist, and this is why I like Derek and other artists. I think you have to be deliberate about choosing the story that you want to tell, and there are a wide varieties of stories to tell that marketplace doesn't necessarily invite because it's predicated on talking about basically evangelical Christianity. So like
Yeah.
where we experienced in the early 90s where that pressure wasn't necessarily there, and there were artists just, that we were products of our churches, and we were products of listening to really cool music growing up. I grew up on Pearl Jam and Aerosmith and Tracy Chapman and 10,000 Maniacs and all this kind
Mm-hmm.
of stuff. I didn't grow up with Sandy Patty and Stephen Curtis Chapman, and yet, I think that's the challenge of an artist, true artist to me, and the ones that I respect are trying to share an experience that they have had as individuals or they have had within a community, but trying to find the universality and the shareability of that experience in a way that people who didn't grow up that way can somehow find a connected humanity and relationship to.
Yeah.
That is not something that CCM necessarily works on. And I think it's possible to do it, but the moving on from that space is, I don't know. To me, that's what's given me hope as a musician, and it gives me something to get up for in the morning. It's not just feeling like I can play like, I don't know what the equivalent is. I grew up with like Mad Libs, right? Where you'd have,
Yeah.
you know what I mean? You'd have a sheet of
Right.
paper and you could fill in your own comedy routine by just filling in the blanks with, the story would be written for you, but you had to put the pivotal word in there. I mean, I think there's something more rich and meaningful to our human experience. And I never really wanted to be a rock star, but I certainly wanted to, when I sat down with my guitar, have an experience that I could share with somebody else. And I don't know, that's what inspires me about artists like Derek. And I think that speaks to his longevity, but I think it also speaks to a smaller marketplace, particularly, when we both are artists that came out of a space where, that had a wide audience that really bought into the branding. And now when we're not a part of that, what does that mean? At the same time, that also makes us strange beings to the secular world because, we're capable of being able to talk about the spiritual experience. But, like you said, the second you tack on Christian into that, people think you're trying to sell them something. And, it's a strange experience to go through, but I'm really grateful for that because it's returned me to a space of just really wanting to strive to kind of create music that's meaningful to people at large.
Mm-hmm. And what one of the things you've talked about a lot is just like you've always sought to bring sort of an authenticity and an honesty to your music, and one part of what we've talked about is that when you return to music, you did do so as you came out openly as gay, and you addressed that sort of head on, and because as you mentioned, you didn't want to have to pretend or hide. You wanted to be the whole person that you are. And since then, you've also started organization Inside Out Faith. Where do you see that conversation and like working with affirming churches and things like that? I speak to a lot of LGBTQ people on this show, and I mean that group in particular, like any person that's LGBTQ, that they just have such negative experiences and experience such trauma in evangelicalism and in evangelical circles. It's really difficult, but at the same time, they, so many also have a very deep spirituality, and that becomes such a difficult conflict for them. So what, with your work with Inside Out Faith, like I'd just love to hear you talk a little bit about that and how that's gone since then.
Yeah. Well, I think initially one of the things that I felt really important to challenge is this narrative that, to be gay and to come out means that you're lacking in faith, or that, you're somehow not that something's wrong with you spiritually. I just found that, like, in my own personal experience, my coming out, just like when no one was watching, my coming out was an exercise that was made possible by a deep spiritual understanding of my created worth.
Mm-hmm.
I just don't know that I would have ever been able to stomach entering back into the career that is of my gift if I didn't have a fundamental sense of my value and my worth.
Mm-hmm.
And that wasn't that I learned that, and that, like I said, that was a paradigm shift for me. That was a turning toward that was deeply tied to my evangelical experience. At the same time, so I also had an awareness, because I'd had a midlife crisis meltdown, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's to be able to say that wasn't true, and that I wasn't worth that, and that this idea that, I don't think you have to be a Christian. I mean, I don't even think you have to be somebody who believes in God to understand the deeply painful insult it is to a human being to say that God doesn't love you.
Yeah.
And, like, you just say, at a certain point, you're just like, even if you think it's a joke, that still is like an insult to your created worth. And I had had so many friends through the years that had dropped away, and that silencing of the LGBTQ community, so far as I had seen and was personally experiencing, was this idea that something had broken and failed in me because I was gay. And that was just, it wasn't true for me, and it wasn't true for so many other people that I'd met.
Mm-hmm.
When I was playing at shows and talking to all these people about their spiritual experience, and this strange incongruency with the value and the courage it took for LGBTQ people that I knew to come out and say, I am loved by God. I am a worthy human being, and I am still here. And the reason why I'm still here is because I have understood the created value of myself. So the fact that an entire community and the fact that an entire church is saying to me that I failed in some way is not just a lie. It's utterly inaccurate. And they wanted, and I think for me, I think that's part of my participation here, is to give value to the spiritual process that entering into that, and as an LGBTQ person has been a vital component to my health, my well-being, my resiliency, and it's just changing the narrative that the church says that gay people can't be Christians, or the reason why we leave churches has not been because we've lost our faith, but because we have been uninvited, because they've been traumatic places, because they have been places that have, for church has been a very dangerous place for the last 15 years for an LGBTQ person. But my participation now is with, like you said, with affirming churches, with Christians who are willing to engage even the remotest possibility that God created us the way that we are, that there's not a moral leveraging about our sexual orientation or our gender identities. That should be leveraged. Kind of goes back to the if-then argument.
Yeah.
If God loves us, then God loves us. And to me, that is a fundamental, I could get into the theology of that, but it is finished. I take that seriously. This idea that if God loves us, then God loves us. And that's kind of the end of it. And how we journey toward our understanding of that and our taking a hold of that is really important. So to be able to engage in that and advocacy and inclusive conversations, it initially was extremely terrifying, because I realized that I was, confronting some pretty angry people who were just still trying to kind of say that LGBTQ people is an unnatural thing or don't belong in our faith communities. But as we're seeing LGBTQ people return, as we're seeing more of these stories come to light. And for me, it's been a joy to be a part of that move to say, hey, yeah, we're here, we're queer, get used to it.
Yeah.
Motif, but yeah, we haven't lost our faith. We've just been silenced. And part of that journey has been able to, I've got a microphone, so you better hold on. I'm going to talk about it. And I've been grateful to be able to have that privilege and that opportunity to do it. And it's been strangely, and I would have never told you this, 15 years ago, it's been an incredibly redemptive process. I've kind of, in many ways, found a deeper appreciation of my spiritual journey, a deeper appreciation of my spiritual tradition. And strangely enough, that's come even on the backs of feeling like I was a failure to contemporary Christianity, a failure as an LGBTQ person. As it's turned out, the more that I've embraced the value of what my faith has taught me, the more appreciative I've had to realize that faith has also prepared me for the journey that I've had. And inside out faith is part of kind of being able to do that, to give permission to be a part of the story that gives people permission to be able to know who they are and to express who they are and participate with faith community in a way that gives them a fruitful life.
Yeah. Yeah. Permission. Oh man, that's definitely something that it can just be so incredibly valuable to someone, just letting them know that they're okay, that's allowed, can be so incredibly powerful. So that's great.
It's such a small thing, right? I was sharing drinks with a friend of mine one day, and he just said to me, you're theologically, you're not an evangelical. And I was like, what? Just that statement alone was such a terrifying statement for me, because I'd grown up in an environment that says that you're not a Christian if you're not evangelical, was right. The essential kind of translation. But at the same time, I've had an incredible life. I mean, I've traveled all over the world, participated in Christian community from a variety of cultures. And I have to remind myself that we all express this experience in different ways. And there's, I don't tick off the boxes for, a card carrying Methodist every day any more than I can tick off all the boxes for an evangelical. Like, but I'm no longer, I think as I've practiced this and this now for a few years, I've realized that, the insult of saying that I'm a cherry picker is meant to erode the confidence I have in my own experience, in the value that I have in being able to go, wow, the Methodists teach me a little bit here, and I really dig that. And thank you for letting me hang out, you guys. And then going over to my evangelical community and hanging out and saying, man, I really want to appreciate that part of, your tradition that speaks to me. I think appreciating the diversity of Christian expression and experience and the way that we develop communities and the way that we worship in different ways is very important. And it's for me, one of the things I feel like kind of informs the work I do in advocacy and inclusion for the LGBTQ community. I mean, there's a real diversity in the way that we approach our faith, and thinking that there's just one surefire way at which that we all approach this is problematic and extremely traumatic, and can halt the journey for something that's a really rich and rewarding experience.
Yeah, that's very true. So you're actually, you have produced 3 albums, and you're actually touring right now as well. 3 albums since your return. So we've sort of talked about your career in these like 2 different acts, so to speak, I guess.
I call them Career 1.0 and Career 2.0.
Oh, there you go. All right.
Go ahead. Career 2.0.
I like that. Career 2.0. And you're on tour right now, correct?
Yeah, I'm getting ready to launch some fall touring. So I'm mostly on the east side of the country this fall. So I'm heading up to the Northeast, Boston, New York. I'm going to be in Texas, I think. So in the South, in Georgia, and it's largely kind of like the east side of Kansas. And then, unfortunately, the West Coast is going to have to wait until the spring of 2019. But yeah, I'll be out doing a tour with the Love Comes Back Around record, which I released a year ago, but only got to tour for a limited amount of time because I was in divinity school. But now I'm done with school. I'm looking forward to kind of coming back and doing that. So we'll have some fun dates this fall. Make sure and to get onto jenniferknapp.com. We'll have all the tour dates listed there.
Awesome. Well, Jennifer, thanks so much for sharing so much of your story and for making all the music you've done over the years.
Oh my gosh. Well, thank you for giving me a call. I deeply appreciate it.